What actually qualifies as gun violence?
Let me start out by saying, with the child death data that I brought to you tonight, this is Georgia, so we're not talking national. I specialize in what goes on in our 159 counties in Georgia. For our last year of complete review, which is 2017, because 2018 numbers are still coming in, there were 131 intentional injury deaths of kids. 55 were caused by firearm. So when I asked my staff to get these numbers together for tonight, it was important that we tell the full story. So when you mention what do we mean by gun violence, that's, again, any type of act involving a gun that causes loss of life. Obviously, that's a violent act. But for the purposes of our definition, that's going to be when there's an act committed by someone that is intentional, involving a firearm, whether it be, a robbery with a firearm and the individual shoots and kills someone, and a homicide that was premeditated and thought out, things of that nature. Again, you can say, well, anything involving a firearm is considered violent, but the unintentional cases, that means the 2-year-old who gets access to the firearm that was in the bedside table or in the glove compartment of the car, various ways that the kids get these firearms, and as a result they die, as she mentioned, the access, that would not be categorized as a violent death as it related to a firearm. But that's just something to keep in mind. Out of 131, 55 involved firearms, and those were intentional deaths of our children in Georgia, ages 0 to 17.
What's the difference between what's happening right here in South DeKalb versus what's happening up in North DeKalb?
Well, let me be honest, from the police standpoint, a lot of violence comes with poverty. And where you have impoverished areas, and you have most of that on the southern side of DeKalb as opposed to the northern DeKalb, you're gonna have violence. And with that violence, you're gonna have gun violence. So the difference is, I'm gonna say, the financial aspect, the poverty. That's one of the main causes of a lot of gun violence when it comes to robberies, burglaries, things like that. And I'm glad the young man said what he said in reference to the culture and what the younger people want, what they see, how they try to keep up with the Joneses. And they want nice things, they want better things, and some are willing to do whatever it takes. And when you have a population that is more impoverished than another side of the town, you're gonna get that disparity. So that's the main difference as far as the policing side of it.
Is there a difference in the type of violence that we're seeing as a result of the poverty?
I'd say the aggression that's used, because you wanna, if you're a criminal, you have a certain goal. And your goal is to, as they say, come up as much as you can. So the aggression that's used to commit some of these robberies, some of these crimes, is harsh. And weapons are used as a way to scare.
Thank you, sir.
And to add to that, someone already alluded to it, keep in mind, and Sarge will agree with me, when we respond to violent crimes, if you will, and there's firearms involved, it is very rare that a death has been caused by a firearm that was lawfully owned. Someone mentioned that. So when criminals are committing crimes, or whether it's gang members, what have you, 90% of the time, probably a little more, that firearm is always going to come back stolen. We run those numbers at the Georgia Crime Information Center, housed within GBI. Those firearms are stolen. In other crimes, once again, where you're breaking and entering into someone's car, into someone's home, that's what they're looking for. A lot of the smash and grabs, they are rifling through looking for the firearms, and then those firearms are used in the crimes that we're talking about now. It is very rare when we're talking about the criminal nexus. Again, when it comes to the unintentional or accidental or the suicides, that's a different story. But when it comes to the use of these guns in violent crimes, as we call it, these weapons are rarely owned by the criminal, if at all.
I just wanted to say one thing that I just thought about when Special Agent Randall mentioned that, and then when Major Johnson, I'm pronouncing your name right, Major Johnson, right? Correct. Sergeant Johnson. Sorry, I like to, you know.
It's Sergeant Pierre.
Sergeant.
I'm standing in for...
Sergeant Pierre, okay, gotcha. Yeah, I like to give honor where honor is due. I know I don't like when people mess up my name, so I like to make sure everybody's name is correct. I think you made a good point if it is so that there is a different kind of violence and a different, or gun violence, a different aggression, I believe you said, behind the violence. And I'm no expert on gun violence in any way, shape, form, or fashion. Me and Isaiah are here lending our youthful voice. But what I can say, in my belief, that the root of violence is anger. And the root of anger is oftentimes hopelessness. And I think that depending on how hopeless you feel in a situation will determine the type of anger or the type of aggression that you put behind violence. And with guns being used as a medium for that violence, I think that it definitely puts us in a place where that can be very valid, Sergeant Pierre, that we do see a different kind of aggression depending on the hopelessness that a young person feels in South DeKalb versus in North DeKalb.
As what's the cultural problem?
So there's several cultural problems. Machismo is one of them. The Sergeant spoke to that a little bit. There's the typical, I'm going to be stereotypical here, 50-year-old white male who feels like, you know, going to the gun range every Saturday and using his however big gun he's got makes him feel good. Truth be told, I like skeet shooting, so I understand some of that. It's changing that culture. I followed a man here this evening in a truck who had a giant NRA sticker on the back. That man is more likely to have his truck broken into than my car is, because he's already telegraphed that he's got a gun in there, and he probably hasn't necessarily locked it in a safe in his truck where it can't be stolen. So I think it's changing the mindset of gun owners to make them realize that if you are going to own a gun, you have to assume the responsibility of owning something that very easily can kill you or a family member or someone else. So changing the culture includes changing poverty. Every Town for Gun Safety has done an urban gun violence study, and where communities have invested in the lower socioeconomic communities with things just as simple as a community garden, you will increase the health, you'll increase the economic outlook, and you'll decrease gun violence. So it's those kinds of things in changing not only our mindsets about what a gun does for us, but also changing our culture in understanding that there are little changes we can make within each of our own communities that will make a difference.
Also, I want to say on a cultural aspect, I think we have to be mindful with what our children watch, see, because many times they want to be that thing, right? So you have the rappers, you have the video games that promote violence. And so you see that. I sometimes say we're living in the Grand Theft Auto generation, right? So a lot of our young kids grew up on Grand Theft Auto, where shooting and violence was just normal. And so a lot of our young people see that. And then they think, oh, if I pick up a gun and shoot, maybe I can reset the video game, but in real life, you can't reset the video game. You can't reset when someone has just been shot and killed and murdered. And so sometimes I think about that and what are our children watching? What are they taking in? And so we have to be mindful and talk to your children about that, because what happens when they go in school and they're talking to their friends at school, are you talking to them back at home about guns and what's going on with them? So I think we have to be very mindful of that.
Culture, and talking about that rite of passage, I know I didn't really explain it earlier. I think that it's really important that we as a community come together and decide that we are going to formulate some type of a rite of passage for men and women in this community. And the reason why I think that is important is because America doesn't have a culture. And so because America, there's no such thing as an American culture. We're all just a bunch of immigrants over here. And now, is there such thing as Italian culture? Absolutely. Such thing as any other European culture or, Hispanic culture? Absolutely. But there's no such thing as an American culture. So we're all trying to fit in where we can get in. And not something that we experienced over in the Eastern Hemisphere. It's all over here in this Western Hemisphere that we don't have a rite of passage. So, I grow up as this young black man, and I'm trying to figure out what it means to be a man, and I'm trying to figure out how to become a man. And if I was to ask every single man in here, what does it mean to be a man? And then if I ask you, how do you become a man? I'm gonna get 1.5 million answers. And we think that's okay because we think that that creates our uniqueness, but it might be a little problematic because that's not something that we experience in the cultures that have been saturated in America from external places like the Hispanic culture, that once you hit 15 or 16 years old, you have what a quinceañera, or in the Jewish culture where you have a bar mitzvah. And this is a standard, not just celebratory event, but that really signifies you going through this rite of passage to become a man. And I just wonder from a culture standpoint, if we were to come together as a community and say, this is what it means to be a man, and this is what it means to become a man, then it might prevent me as a young black man from growing up trying to discover my own passage and following everybody's advice. I come to school and somebody tells me this is what it means to be a man, and then I go home and they're telling me something different, and then I go up the street and I hear another community activist telling me something different. I think we've got to come together and actually create a culture by developing a rite of passage. I think that is really, really crucial for us to do.
So we talked about access. Someone mentioned access as a part of the cause of the problem with gun violence. Can we elaborate on that a little bit more? What's the access problem that's causing the gun violence that we're experiencing?
Well, I'll jump right in. As we mentioned before, you already heard, our position as a state law enforcement agency about weapons is simply this. If you are going to own guns, if you are going to be a gun owner, you must be a responsible gun owner. You must make sure, again, what Andrea mentioned, that children do not have access to lethal means. And when I say children, understand that, but you know what it means to be responsible for your child. If they find your young child outside wandering around while it's icy cold, like you see all the time in the news for some reason, that child is not responsible for himself. If he's out there and he becomes hypothermic and he dies, somebody is going to be held accountable for that. It's the same way with firearms. That child is not responsible for that, whether they take the weapon and they use it against themselves intentionally or what have you. So when we talk about access, that's number one. I like the way she expanded it to say, well, if you have weapons in your car, I told you earlier, that's where the criminals get their guns from. They buy them off the street, or where do you think they get them from on the street? Yeah, you hear about gun trafficking and things of that nature, but that's not that big of a deal as to what you might think from watching TV. They get these weapons because they're stolen by the hundreds and hundreds every day in our cities. They're stolen from stores, pawn shops, but homes and vehicles. That's the majority of the weapons accounted for in violent crimes. They're being sold on the street. They're being swapped for drugs and things of that nature. So that's one of the things when we talk about access. The gun owners, and I'm going to go ahead and put this out there because I know you guys want to get into it. We talk about North DeKalb and South DeKalb. I can take the criticism. So when we talk about the weapons up north that are in the homes, because you have the middle-aged white male she mentioned who loves to shoot, or shoot skeet or shoot whatever or shoot for fun. And I'm not making light of that because I love my guns. But when they gave me the gun, they taught me how to use it. They taught me how to be safe with it. They taught me how to secure it. And I have never had an incident happen in or around my home as a result of it. So I believe that you can do this the right way. But in North DeKalb, they're breaking into those houses and those cars and big trucks, stealing the guns, and then they coming down here swapping them for drugs and things of that nature, and they may be more likely to be used in a violent crime here on the south end, if that makes sense.
So what are some things that we can do to keep the guns out of the wrong hands? You mentioned how you were trained and you were taught and you were told what the rules were and you were properly prepared to remain a responsible gun owner. But what are some things that we can do as everyday citizens to keep our children, to keep our neighbors, to keep someone who breaks into our home from actually having access to these guns that are becoming more and more of a problem?
So Mom's worked with the National Sports Shooting Foundation to come up with a program that we call Be Smart. Out on the tables outside in the lobby, there were some brochures and some cards about it. And Be Smart is just an acronym. And it's S-M-A-R-T, SMART. The first stands for securing your weapons. What that means is that if you are a gun owner, it should be locked, inaccessible to children and teens, unloaded, with your ammunition stored separately and locked. Our former chapter leader, Lindsay Donovan, who's also a veteran, as is her husband, they have a Glock 9mm. They live in Savannah. They use it for protection for their home. They regularly have a drill once a month after their children go to bed. Stored in a safe up on the top of the closet, and it's bolted into the wall with the lights out. Once a month, they see how fast they can get to where the ammunition is locked, and then they see how fast they can get the gun loaded and out of the safe. Their number one time is 3 seconds from their bedroom and loaded. So that when you hear somebody say, well, if I lock it up, I don't have access to it. Well, no, that's why you train, so that you know where it is. Safes now, all you need is a fingerprint and it will open up. The next one is M, which is modeling responsible behavior with that firearm. That means don't clean it if your 2-year-old is sitting there in the room with you. It means make sure that your child sees you take it out of the locked safe, you put it into a locked box, you take it into the car, and you don't take it back out again in front of them. Just like we model for our children all kinds of behavior, how how to eat properly and not with our hands, how to sit, still at the table. We also can model being a responsible gun owner. The third one is an A, which is ask. That means when your children go to somebody's house, make sure you ask. And you can say, I'm a gun owner, and I keep, our weapons stored, so you never have to worry if, Johnny comes to our house. I know, Andrew's coming to yours. I just want to make sure he is very curious. It's locked if you own one. And it's very non-judgmental. It's very uncomfortable, but we talk about peanut allergies and we talk about pet allergies, and we have those conversations. Asking if there's a gun in the home and how it's secured is just another one of those similar things. The next is R, which is recognize the signs of teen suicide. Again, if you're a responsible gun owner, your teen should not have access to that safe or the code or the key or however that safe is locked up. So recognizing when your children or another child that you're familiar with is having an issue. Lots of people attempt suicide. Most only attempt it once and never try it again. 50% of all suicides are successful. Firearm suicide is 90% successful. So recognizing those signs when a child is in crisis. And then lastly, the T stands for tell everyone you know about the Be Smart program and how to make sure that they're storing their weapons as well. So that's how you keep your access, whether it's in the car, whether it's in the home. It should always be locked and it should always be inaccessible to anybody who is under the age of responsibility, which for most teens, because I have a 23-year-old, he's not fully responsible yet. Most psychologists and psychiatrists will tell you that the brain doesn't reach maturity until around age 25. So up until then, although you are legal to buy a firearm at age 21 for a handgun and age 18 here in Georgia for a long gun, understand that those 18 to 25-year-olds, it's not all together up there yet. So also some things to think about.
And if I can add, we talked just a lot about those who actually own guns and own it in a proper manner, but we just said that many of the guns on the street that are doing killings and shootings aren't from individuals who actually own the guns. So what we need from the community is to report when you see things. A lot of times, some members in the community like, I might have saw somebody break into the house, but I don't want to call the police. I don't want to get involved. But that's what we need. We need involvement. We need you to, when you see something suspicious in the neighborhood, call. Let the police come out. Let the police check it out. It might not be anything, but you'd rather err on the side of caution than to not err on the side of caution. If you see someone breaking into a vehicle, because that vehicle might have a gun in it. So you want to report what you're seeing so that we can become aware of it. So that's what the community, one thing that the community can do is become more active and engaged in what's going on.
We're hearing a lot about mental health in this conversation about gun violence. What role does mental health play in the problem that we're seeing?
I've been at this for a very long time, so I got a lot of these answers. So in the United States, there are estimated over 330 million guns. That's one gun for every person in this country, man, woman, and child. Other countries, other developed nations, have similar rates of mental illness. What they do not have is an access issue that we have here in the United States. So we've been talking a lot about access, obviously, because that is the most critical part of gun violence, is lethal, how do you say it?
Lethal means.
Lethal means. So mental health, no offense, but Great Britain got as many crazy people as we do. They don't have a gun violence problem. Their police, their bobbies don't even carry guns. Only their elite officers and their military do. So it has to do more with the access. And again, one of the pieces of legislation that I would love to see sponsored this year in the Georgia State House is what's called a red flag law, which means that if someone is in crisis and is either going to be harmful to themselves or to someone else, that there can be a temporary order that is issued that would allow a family member or some, responsible party to go in and remove the weapons from that home so that that individual can't go out and hurt other people or themselves. So mental health is an issue, but it's not the only issue.
As it relates to our youth that are committing suicide by firearm, more than half of those kids had already been identified as having voiced a previous suicidal ideation, having been diagnosed with some type of mental health issue, and was being treated, needed to be treated, et cetera, et cetera. The risk factors had already been identified. So once again, we do know that that population, and this is nationwide, not just Georgia, but we're really consistent as far as white males being at the top, most high risk for committing suicide. Georgia is no different. So for the, again, two categories, but the firearms that are in the house of gun owners, not convicted felons or someone that's not supposed to have a weapon, those kids are using those guns at home. I do not have one case that has come across my desk in the years that I've been doing this where a child went and borrowed a gun from someone else or from a neighbor. Every child that committed suicide by firearm, they actually got the weapon, got access to the lethal means at home or a family member's house, grandparents' house. And they knew where the weapons were, stored, where the weapons were being kept. So a few things have to happen, whether we're talking about a 2-year-old that comes across a weapon or a 17-year-old who is suicidal. They have to have access, number one. As we mentioned, take it away. Number two, the weapon was obviously loaded, okay? And number three, there was no supervision, because a 2-year-old that gets a firearm that someone is paying attention to, they're gonna be able to intervene. The 17-year-old who is suicidal, who gets access to the weapon and their supervision or someone is home or around, they're going to intervene. So there's three different, I call them failures in the cases of the younger kids, but there are three things that have to occur for these deaths to actually occur.
We have a question from the audience that this is probably a good time to ask. We talked about culture and the impact that it has on gun violence. We also talked about what people see and how they imitate that. So what can we do to deter the fascination, particularly that children and teenagers have with guns based off of what they are seeing on video games, on TV, and in the home? How can we reduce that fascination?
Household by household. Again, I'm kind of like Andrea, we've been doing this for so long, and this is what I do for a living. Household by household. So when you say, well, what can we do to reduce this? Number one, we're never going to win a fight against the gaming industry. So you can forget that. It's kind of like us fighting against the NRA. Not that I advocate for that. Those are the battles that we're not winning. So that's a broad question. It's household by household. For example, in my household, we don't have video games that depict those things, whether it's the children or nephews or the older kids. That's just something that I do not allow. I have a 22-year-old drama queen, as she mentioned, so I have to put myself out there being transparent. I'm like everybody else. I'm not perfect, but when she was going through her rough patch, guess what? I removed the lethal means from my house, and I'm in law enforcement because you don't want to run that risk of something happening. So as it relates to the violence that they're seeing, whether it's a video game, whether it's movies, I don't allow young children to watch R-rated movies where they say, well, recommended for teens because there's violence. But that is household by household. I also know people who say, hey, I'm not sheltering my kids. This is reality. They are going to be exposed to it sooner or later. That's one family's opinion. I have no control, the government has no control on how they're raising their kids, but what we would tell you is awareness. Like, we have parents, and thank you for being here, because that means you actually care about, you know, the young people and what we're talking about, is household by household. And there are some households where this stuff is a norm. The kids can watch R-rated violent movies. They can watch the video games where they're shooting citizens and get points, and you really get big points if you shoot a cop in the head. This stuff is out there, and I hope nobody in here has that kind of stuff in their house, but it is household by household, and in some instances, we are never going to be able to change that, but we certainly, our job is to just raise awareness and let you know some of these kids cannot separate that. Some of these kids are desensitized to what they're seeing on television and video games, and it hasn't come up yet, but social media and the internet, reduce it. I have a young son. He doesn't have a smartphone, but his classmate at 7 years old does. And he takes it to school, and his parents trust that he's going to do the right thing and not look at certain things, YouTube, those games on there. That's my household. But that's what we're up against when you say, well, what can we do? Awareness. Talk to somebody about what you heard here tonight, and it could make a difference.
A follow-up question that also...
Can I say one thing
Okay,
right here? I absolutely agree. I think it is a household, you know, by household, you know, endeavor that we have to take up. And when Simone said earlier that a lot of young people will play these games and will, you know, feel as though, and we're desensitized by it. And until we get in spaces like this, where we have these conversations, and it's amazing that we've got people my age who are here, because more than likely, because we're having such blatant conversations about this in front of our young people, those young people are going to more than likely be way more cognizant of how they repress gun violence and desensitize it, you know, by watching it in movies and television and playing video games and this, that, and the other. It shouldn't take, I'm 21 years old, and I've had 17 friends be killed through gun violence. I'm only 21. I've only went through, you know, elementary, middle, high school, and I'm in college. And I've had 17 friends, that's 17 funerals, and that's hundreds and hundreds of young people who've been at these funerals. And it shocks their mind just like it shocks mine, but it shouldn't take that. But a lot of people like myself, until a few years ago when these situations started to happen, just wouldn't realize that it's real, that gun violence is real. You know, and I think that's what it comes down to, is definitely just exposure. We've got to make more young people like myself aware. We've got to pack these rooms out with young people my age who have this tendency to be desensitized by gun violence. And so we've got to keep on having these type of conversations. You know, I commend this sorority, this chapter, for doing this, and we've got to keep on doing things like this, and we've got to pack it out, and we've got to get more young people my age in the room, because I think that that's one of the ways that we do fix this situation. We've just got to make people my age aware that this is real. This is real, and it can affect you.
It's also important, because I hear this a lot. I've heard this a lot in my career. I've heard this from, you know, elderly or women or whoever. They say, I will never own a gun. I will never touch a gun. I will never have anything to do with a gun. Me personally, I don't think that's the right mindset. And I mean, I say that to mean you should familiarize yourself, you should learn, you should educate yourself about guns and weapons, because like the lady said here, 330 million, that's one for every person in the country. So chances are, in your lifetime, somehow, some way, you will encounter a situation where you will be around a gun. What do you do if you're that person that says, I don't want to have anything to do with guns, I don't know, I don't want to know anything about guns. I don't want to, whatever. And your 7 or 8-year-old walks in the house one day, or you're at the park, and they come up to you and say, "Mommy, look what I found," and it's a gun. Before a police officer is ever, you know, introduced to his gun in the academy, and you know what I'm saying this from experience, you know, you're sat there, they place the box in front of you. When you open the box, it might be 2 days before you even touch that weapon. You're trained on the, you know, the nomenclature, the names, the parts, everything about that weapon before you even take it out of the box. It's important that you familiarize yourself, educate yourself, and you don't have to go out and now start buying guns and collecting guns, but at least you know the basic minimum safety principles. I tell this story, it's experience that happened to me when I was a rookie and I was on the road, and I answered a prowler call, and I searched it. The lady was 85 years old, and I searched the perimeter of her house, and then I went and knocked on her door, and she came outside, and I was speaking to her in the driveway, and she had an apron on and a towel in her hand, and I'm telling her, you know, "Ma'am, I searched your perimeter. You know, I didn't see anything. If you do see something, if you think you see something again or someone again, you know, just call us back out. We'll be out." And she says to me, "There's no need for that because I got this." And then she pulls a towel back, and she had a gun, which, I mean, it's funny now, but the scary part was that she was standing there the entire time with that gun pointed at my chest. Not purposely, it just happens to be I was standing in front of her and she had her kitchen towel over her hand and that weapon was pointed at her chest. But when I saw the way she was holding it, even it wasn't safe to be pointing it at me, but she didn't have her finger on the trigger. She had it placed on the side, which you're trained to do until you're gonna shoot. That finger doesn't go on the trigger. And then she explained to me how she knew Captain so-and-so, and he taught her about weapons, and for the rest of the time standing there speaking with her, I felt completely safe. I didn't tell her to put it away, or, you know, I said, you know, just move it. You know, he pointed it towards me, whatever, but the fact is I felt totally safe with this 85-year-old, you know, elderly person with that weapon because she was trained. She was educated on it. So it's important, even if you don't want to have anything to do with guns, at least try to educate yourself for that time where you will encounter a situation where you will be around a weapon and you will either need to make it safe, you know, take the round out of the chamber, drop the magazine, do something safe with it, and to get it to an officer or call 911 or whatever. That's very important because I'm pretty sure there are plenty of people in here right now that have never, ever touched a gun. I'm pretty sure there's people that have, but for those who have never, ever touched it, just think to yourself, what would you do if tonight you went home and your child walked in and said, "Hey, look what I found, Mom, Dad." What are you gonna do?
Can I say one more thing about deterrence? A lot of times I think when we talk to our young people, if we tell them kind of what some of the consequences actually are, like if you're involved in an incident with a gun, I mean in an intentional incident like an armed robbery, because sometimes our young people don't really understand the real consequences of that. They're like, okay, well I'm a juvenile, I'm young, so if I have an armed robbery, I'm going to go to juvenile court. We actually have from our district attorney's office, our deputy of our juvenile division, and she can pen in the back. But what they don't realize is an armed robbery will be treated as an adult. And that's 10 years in prison, minimum, if you're convicted. If it's a murder, you're treated like an adult. That's life. That's life. And so sometimes when we don't teach our kids the consequences of that, or if you're with a friend, because this is what happens a lot, you're with your friend goes in the store, they rob somebody. Matter of fact, I just drove my boyfriend over there, and he robbed someone with the gun. I'm not gonna get in trouble. Yes, you are. Because you're what we call a party to the crime. And you get the same amount of time as the person who had the gun. 10 years, and you just drove the vehicle. So I think sometimes if we educate our young people about the consequences are the same, it can be the same for you. Do you really want to throw away your life at 15, 16, and 17 years old? No, you don't want to do that. And so sometimes I think a deterrence is the reality. The reality is when you watch on TV, if you watch these rappers, they're not shooting anyone. The rappers are going back to their mansion or their apartment or their condo or wherever they live. But guess what? You'll be in the DeKalb County Jail right down there on Memorial Drive eating bologna cheese sandwiches. I mean, but and I don't say that being funny, but I say that being very serious, that sometimes I think telling our kids about the real reality about what happens. You can come on down to the courthouse on any given week, and unfortunately, when I walk into the courthouse, I see 3 rows, very sadly, normally of young African-American males, somewhere between the ages of 18 and 23, charged with armed robberies, aggravated assaults, and it hurts. Because these could be my little brothers, my little cousins, but it's a reality, and unfortunately, we see it every single day. So sometimes I think just having that conversation, like I said, feel free. I will leave my car, you can come down any day I have court. And come down and you can see the reality of what's happening. Some could be your classmates. You may know some of your classmates, they've been locked up, you didn't see them in class for a little while. They've been in RYDC or down in DeKalb County, depending on how old they are. So sometimes I think that might be a deterrence as well.
I asked Sergeant Pierre because we have several questions about how we can educate ourselves about guns. He spoke in depth about the importance of educating ourselves. So if we know nothing about guns, we've never touched a gun, or even afraid of guns, what are some steps or some resources that we can take to become more informed?
The first thing you can do, and wherever you live, whatever jurisdiction you live, I can guarantee you, whatever police department that you live in that jurisdiction has some type of citizen academy, junior police academy, some type of program like that, or they have a public education specialist, a community-oriented police, neighborhood enforcement team, something like that. There's a program at every department in every jurisdiction, and all you have to do is show up to your local police department and ask them, what program can I volunteer for or sign up for where I can learn about guns. You can go to a gun range. You don't even have to be a gun owner. You can go to a gun range, and that range master will put you through a course, put you through, something quick. You can find out from any of your friends or family who own guns and find out where they were trained or what courses they've taken. You can Google it. I mean, there's abundant amount of things you can do, but first and foremost, go to your local police precinct, and they'll introduce you to some type of program where you can learn in reference to guns.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about the law. With the murder of Trayvon Martin, stand your ground was thrust into all of our faces. And that's the law in a lot of states in America. What exactly does that law hold? What does it mean to stand your ground?
Well, let me just say real quick in reference to that. When it comes to that law, what everybody needs to understand is this is not a law that protects police or protects a certain part of the population or anything like this. This law applies to everyone. To me, you, regular, Joe Schmo citizen, and we have that use of force law basically in Georgia also. It's not called stand your ground, but everybody refers to it as stand your ground because of that high profile case. But the bottom line is, if you articulate that you feel your life is in danger, that you're protecting your life or the life of another, you have the right to stand your ground. You have the right to use deadly force. And we refer to it, in policing as use of force. And that use of force, we have a specific code section as it relates to police, but there's a specific code section in the state of Georgia that covers every person in the state of Georgia. You have the right to use deadly force to protect yourself if you feel that your life or the life of another is in danger, period, point blank. It doesn't just cover police or security guards, or it covers everyone. As long as you can articulate that your life was in danger. Where we get into a gray area is that, you know, we have people that are getting into these situations and get involved in shootings and whatnot, and they try to stretch the truth as to what happened and try to articulate how their life was in danger when obviously it wasn't. You know, somebody running from your car after they broke in, and you shoot them as they're 20 yards down the street, and you shoot them in the back of their head. It's gonna be kind of tough to articulate that you felt your life was in danger. So it's very simple. It's very simple. You hear a lot of these arguments, and the issue, in my opinion, with the Trayvon Martin situation is it was just those two, and you really didn't have any witnesses. It was one word against another, and you know the other party unfortunately wasn't there. So it was just really tough to tell what actually went down. And you had one person that was articulating he felt his life was in danger, and whatever the jury found, that's what they found. But that is the law, and it covers every single one of you. Every one of you has the right to do it.
That is primarily what it is. What's very important is what we say, if one reasonably believes, and so the issue becomes what's reasonable. So that's kind of what that gray area is, and it'll be all fact determined. And so every case is going to be very different, and as prosecutors, our job is once those cases come in, the GBI, if there's a police-involved shooting, will look at those facts and investigate those facts and make a decision on whether or not we believe that that individual should have or should not have been able to, had a duty to retreat or not. And so it's all about a reasonable belief, and that's something that we as prosecutors have to determine given all of the facts and all of the investigation.
So today we had a very great forum with a lot of great people about gun violence, a very serious topic that we sometimes don't talk about. You know, we had a great time here today, this afternoon. Well, you know, here in South DeKalb, you know, gun violence is very prevalent, especially in the community that we live in right now. You know, kids see guns all the time, and when you know what to do in certain situations, you know, that's the greatest peace of mind you can have. What I like to tell the kids about gun violence is if you see something, say something. That's the best advice I could give a student, you know, speak up.
Particularly with GBI, we have the Child Fatality Review Unit, and unfortunately we track all the deaths of children in the state of Georgia, not just DeKalb County, but certainly we track deaths of kids that are the result of firearms, and whether that's firearms that are used in a homicide, firearms that are used in an unintentional or accidental shooting where a child will get a hold to a gun and accidentally shoot themselves or someone else, and then also suicide-related deaths of children. We would track those as well. One of the things that I talk about all the time, as we did here tonight, is just raising awareness. This forum was a perfect start to getting the message out about what we can do to reduce incidents of gun violence. Not only gun violence, but I always like to say the deaths of kids as it relates to guns. So first you have to raise awareness and let the community know it's a problem. One of the other things you can do is reduce the lethal means in the home. So if you are a gun owner, we want to make sure that you're properly storing those weapons away from kids. If you have weapons in your vehicle, they need to be locked. We know that the majority of the crimes that are committed on the street that involve guns, those guns are stolen. They're not weapons that have been purchased by the offender. Just in closing, again, we mentioned it earlier here that this is everybody's problem. Whether you have kids or not, you know a child, you're related to a child, it's important that we embrace these kids, whether they have anger issues that are going to lead to a gun violence incident, whether they have issues and they're in crisis in terms of mental health and they would use a firearm to harm themselves. We have got to reach out and embrace our young people to make sure that they're okay. If they're struggling, we need to get them to resources that can assist them.
Tonight, we were fortunate enough to be able to bring together a panel of experts and advocates on the topic of gun violence to speak with our community on ways to promote awareness as well as ways to prevent gun violence in our communities. The event tonight was hosted by the ladies of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, the Decatur Alumni Chapter, as well as the DeKalb chapter of Moms Demand Action. I would just like to thank DeKalb County School System for its support, our principal, Dr. Lakeisha Walker, as well as all of the panelists and the community members that came out to support the event.